Welcome back to Sputnik, orbiting the world with me, George Galloway.
And me, Gayatri.
The electoral kaleidoscope has been shaken. The pieces are in flux. But where will they land?
Britain has turned blue. Or has it? Only 24% of the British people voted for David Cameron, yet he now has untrammeled power to do whatever he likes, and for 5 long years.
Ever more cuts and austerity, undreamt of privatizations. A huge reduction in the size of the state.
Except the security state. That, we are already promised, will get larger and more invasive than anything seen in Britain in peacetime.
Today we've assembled 2 of the most astute observers of the British political scene. First off, the associate editor of The Guardian newspaper, Seumas Milne. Seumas, welcome to Sputnik. It looked like a landslide. If you look at the map, as Gayatri said, Britain has turned blue. But it's not quite like that, really, is it?
No, it's no kind of landslide. I mean, the Tories have got a majority of 12, which is a workable majority, but it's a small one historically. And of course, as you were saying, you know, the proportion of the population that voted for the Tories is under a quarter. They even didn't manage to get 37% of those who voted, and the turnout was low. But that's the rules of the game. Now, I think what made it feel...
The vote went up, what? 0 point something, wasn't it?
0.8% was their increase in the vote, and the increase in the Labour vote was 1.4%. What made it look like a landslide on the night was the expectations which had been built up by the polling in the previous 2 or 3 weeks in particular, which had promised that there would be a dead heat between the 2 main parties, and that would have meant possibly a Labour-led government with a rainbow coalition of progressive parties behind it, because that was how the numbers would have stacked up if that had been correct. And it wasn't correct. And that night, on the night of the election, when people saw the exit poll, across Britain, they were astounded because it was so out of kilter with what had been suggested by the polls. And now people are obviously digging into why that was the case. But I think in relation to how it actually is going to look for the next 2 or 3 years, it's a far weaker government than has been talked about in the last few days, I think. That majority will start to erode. There are also...
Well, I've sat in many parliaments with small majorities like that, and they don't survive first contact with the enemy and with reality, and I mean the enemy within.
Of course.
John Major's government was absolute hell for the Prime Minister, and he had more than 12, I think, of a majority. And Europe, of course, remains a big fissure. In your excellent piece in The Guardian this week, you highlighted also the Scottish question, which is going to be very, very significant in this Parliament. So why then has he come out fighting quite so aggressively? I mean, the early few days were one announcement after another of Thatcherite policies that Mrs. Thatcher might have balked at.
Well, I mean, it makes sense from the Tory point of view, doesn't it? Because they've had a build-up of resentment within the Conservative Party in Parliament and outside at Cameron's constant ducking and diving and compromises with the Liberal Democrats under the coalition. There's the sense that these people didn't get jobs who wanted them, and that Cameron was never right-wing enough for them, that if he had been more right-wing, he would have won the election in 2010. And now is the chance to give them the jobs and show his true Tory mettle. And then the other point is that if you want to get your radical stuff in for any government, it's best to do it quickly, because it becomes more difficult as time goes on. The majority will start to erode. And so I think from the Tory point of view, it's the right thing to do to be radical at the beginning. And they're certainly, rolling it out rapidly. So we've got one thing after another. I mean, one of the most dramatic things, which was in the election manifesto but wasn't hardly discussed in the election, is the plan to make strikes as good as illegal by setting thresholds for voting and turnout, which are just never met in most strike ballots, because they insist on a postal balloting system instead of internet balloting, which would be much easier for people to vote in. So there's going to be a battle about that. Then there's the threat to introduce new legislation against so-called extremism, which is, as far as I can see from what's been said, a full-on attack on freedom of speech in Britain only a few months after we were all Charlie.
All in the name of British values.
All in the name of British values.
It was Je suis Charlie, but now it's no longer a British value that people are allowed to hold views and express them within the law. That's what Cameron has said.
Part of that was held back under the previous government by Lib Dem ministers, but not only. There was opposition from within the Tory party to that because it was seen as so illiberal.
Authoritarian?
Yeah, so authoritarian. And there's obviously a faction within the Tory party that is quite libertarian and doesn't like that kind of stuff. So I think the opportunities for a battle about many of these things are going to be there, both inside Parliament and outside Parliament. So the demoralisation that the majority of Britain who didn't vote for this government is feeling or has been feeling in recent days, I think that will start to dissipate as people see the opportunities for taking the government on and for changing some of their direction.
It's not just Muslims, though, is it?
Exactly, yes.
We were discussing this this morning. We're used to, inured to, attacks on Muslim expression. But the wording of the new extremism agenda is far wider than that. It's threatening to people on Twitter, on Facebook, it's threatening to alternative broadcasters, and so on.
Because it's actually the classic Cold War definition of what they used to call subversion, which is undermining parliamentary democracy, something which can be interpreted in any way the government chooses. And so if they want to clamp down on all sorts of political activity against the government, against foreign wars, against threats to the right to take industrial action, they can do it under this legislation. I mean, it is a very, very authoritarian measure.
And almost war-like speak. Yeah, it's like in wartime.
It was extraordinarily belligerent. I mean, it was saying that we've been far too tolerant, prepared to let people have their views as long as they were within the law, as long as there was no violence. But now we're going to turn that page.
I mean, they're explicitly saying they will clamp down on things which are not currently illegal, not only incitement to violence, but incitement to hatred of, religious or ethnic or gender or other forms of hate speech. That's already covered. No, it's not about that. This is about politics. This is about people's right to argue their case for political alternatives, and they're planning right now to clamp down on it, while on the other side of the world they'll be denouncing governments elsewhere for doing exactly the same thing.
They'll be overthrowing them if they can. Let's turn to Labour politics. In your excellent piece in The Guardian this week, you talked about what Labour should not do, that they should not turn back to Blairism, essentially. Tony Blair, who only a year or so ago looked set for a kind of wintry exile, Chilcot and the rest looming, he's now right back centre stage, isn't he?
Well, they were waiting for this moment, and they have been preparing for weeks and months for Labour's defeat so that they could try and retake the party, which, of course, they've never lost control of completely at all, but their position was weakened after Ed Miliband became leader. And the moment the results came in, they were out of the traps. First Peter Mandelson and Tony Blair, who were the architects of New Labour, and then a string of ex-New Labour ministers, almost all of whom became directors in privatised companies that they'd previously been handing out contracts to, arguing the case for a return to what they regard as the centre ground, which is, I think, can be interpreted best as the centre ground as perceived from the City of London, corporations and the corporate-controlled media, rather than the actual centre ground of where British public opinion is. And for they were attacking Ed Miliband, obviously, as being too anti-business, too left-wing,
wearing a red tie too often. I saw one report.
Yeah. But I mean, the reality is that their politics, which was successful in the 1990s, in a period when there was a city-funded, credit-fueled boom, and the Cold War had just ended. Since the crash of that neoliberal economic model and economic system, which took place in 2008, and the recovery, not only here, but throughout the Western economies, has still not really taken place at all. The economies are still crippled by that terrible crisis. The idea that you can just wind the clock back and be successful in that narrow sense again is just not realistic. We've just had an election where not only votes hemorrhaged off to the Greens, the Scottish National Party, both of whom had positioned themselves well to the left of the Ed Miliband's Labour Party, but also to the UK Independence Party, part of whose appeal is to working class voters who believe themselves not to be served by the Labour Party in the New Labour era and afterwards. They didn't notice enough of a difference.
And by globalisation.
And by globalisation and by the destruction of the industrial base and the working and the employment base in those areas. You know, the idea that by appealing to them on the basis of New Labour politics, of pro-corporate, middle-class orientated politics alone, that the idea you're going to win them back is just laughable. Nor, for that matter, in the Tory-Labour marginal seats where Labour hardly made any progress at all. You can't ignore the large working-class disaffection with Labour there either, because those votes often went to UKIP or they didn't vote at all. And we're just getting the evidence now to show that actually Labour's problem was bigger with working-class voters than it was with the middle-income voters that the Blairites and New Labour politicians of yesteryear are saying that should be the focus of everything. So that's clearly not the answer, but they have huge support in the media who want to still present them 25 years later as modernisers in a rather bizarre formula. But they're supported, obviously, by the corporate interests in the country, by the City of London, by the corporate-owned media, and that's giving them a big win. And obviously, because Labour's been defeated and it didn't make much progress electorally under Ed Miliband, after a period in which not only did he not position the party in a way that was clear enough to most of the potential voters, but also didn't discredit the Tory claim that Labour had been responsible, Labour's overspending had been responsible for the crisis, which is laughable economically, but was repeated ad nauseum in the media and by the Tory politicians. But obviously Labour didn't succeed. And so in those circumstances, it's a golden moment for the failed politics of Blairism and New Labour, who oversaw a loss of 5 million Labour votes between 1997 and 2010 to make a comeback. But it's obviously not the answer, not only for Labour Party, but for people in Britain who want an alternative government. It's got to be something different, but it's going to be a difficult struggle, I think.
The 5 million missing Labour voters, that'll be the question, or ought to be the question, but may not. Thanks very much, Seumas Milne. Coming up after the break, more on the new Blue Britain with RT's crack political analyst, Neil Clark. Don't miss it. Welcome back to Sputnik. David Cameron is now the most powerful Tory Prime Minister since Margaret Thatcher, and he seems to have found a long-lost appreciation for the Iron Lady. Indeed, he's getting ready to venture where she might not have dared.
But how much of a mandate for all this does he really have? And what will become of the once proud Labour Party? Will it turn right, back to Blair, or will it turn left, back to real Labour?
That's the question we'll now put to one of the shrewdest of Britain's political analysts, crack commentator Neil Clark. Neil, let's deal with this issue of the mandate first. We know that less than a quarter of the British people voted for them, yet they got an overall parliamentary majority. We know that only half the Scottish people voted SNP, but they got, seems like 99% of the seats. Isn't one of the first things that's thrown up here is the peculiarity, to say the least, of the British electoral system?
Oh, absolutely. I think the British electoral system is fundamentally undemocratic. And you don't have to be a UKIP supporter to really appreciate how badly done they've been, because they polled, I think it was...
just under 4 million votes.
And they get one MP, and the Greens get 1.1 million votes, which is a great poll for them, and they get one seat. So I think that reform of our electoral system really is up there on the list of things progressives need to be campaigning for. You know, because it's a block on progressive politics in this country.
Yeah, and it forces within the Labour Party certain choices that wouldn't otherwise be there. I'll come to that in a minute. UKIP would have had more than 80 MPs under proportional representation. And yet we can't get proportional representation unless the big parties agree to it. There's no chance of the Tories agreeing to it. They're the beneficiaries of it. Any sign that Labour might be rethinking its position
Well,
on
I
this?
hope so. I hope so, because I've just written an article for the RT website on how it happens that the most pro-establishment party always wins British elections. And in fact, that's been the case since 1974. Harold Wilson in 1974 was the last time a party that wasn't the establishment's #1 choice won an election in Britain. And the electoral system plays a big part in this, in preventing progressive parties from being elected. And so I think the Labour Party now really ought to reconsider its position because it's lost out. And I think that, if you look at it, it's not just about the votes. We talk about the Greens got 1.1 million. How many more people would have voted Green had they believed... If it counted. And so I think that a lot of people, as we know, the scaremongering in this election was absolutely outrageous. People were scared into voting Conservative, and I think that electoral reform is, as I said, I think it's what progressives should be campaigning for now.
We don't have a state-run media in this country, but then we don't need one.
No, absolutely, yes.
The privately owned media does the job unbribed.
Yes.
You might say. Lenin, I should tell you, once said the only thing certain about British elections is who's going to lose them.
Yes, absolutely.
He meant the working people. And that's been true, arguably, always. Let's talk about UKIP for a minute. They are something of a phenomenon. They did far more damage to Labour than they did to the Conservatives. They only ended up with one MP who looks like he might be on his bike out of UKIP, if recent coverage is anything to go by. How do you analyse UKIP and its voters?
I think it's very interesting to analyse the rise of UKIP, because if you think about it, back in 2012 and 13, they got a very positive press. The media was all behind them at the time of the European elections last year, when they did very, very well.
They won them.
Yes, and the talk was what a threat they posed to the Conservative Party. But I think UKIP in themselves have been manipulated too by the likes of Rupert Murdoch and the media barons, because it's quite clear, as you said, that UKIP seriously damaged the chances of Labour in this election. Labour lost an awful lot of votes in England to UKIP. And I think that, where they've got one seat, and of course there's a lot of anger among UKIP supporters now, I think that Ed Miliband, and I wrote about this several times, made a key mistake in not agreeing to an EU referendum. I think I'm not saying that all the people who voted UKIP moved from Labour was because of that issue, but I think that was an important issue.
It's easy to imagine that UKIP voters are thoroughly reactionary from A to Z, but that's not true.
No,
on economic questions, for example, on issues of globalisation, the remorseless march of inhuman capitalism, on public ownership, nationalisation.
Public ownership, that's an interesting point. Yeah, absolutely.
They are actually blue-collar Labour.
Well, when I set up my pressure group, the Campaign for Public Ownership, which is a pressure group to campaign for the renationalisation of the railways and the other utilities, the first inquiries we got were from UKIP members. And UKIP members have been very supportive. And so I think on economic matters, the average UKIP voter is very much to the left, taking old Labour positions, anti-globalisation, for public ownership. And I think that is another reason why Labour has perhaps lost votes to UKIP, if they haven't been strong enough in opposing globalisation and supporting public ownership. And I think this sort of the way that, as I said, the UKIP voters are portrayed as these very right-wing people. They're not. I think on economic matters, they are on the left, which is why I think another reason why they've done well in England, taking votes off Labour. So Labour's got to look at that. And the idea that Labour can recapture voters and can win elections by going back to Blairism is absolutely ludicrous when you think of where they've lost votes to. UKIP voters, the last people they're going to vote for are Blairites.
It's the very point I was about to raise with you. The idea that, say, conjuring Chuka Umunna out of a hat as a kind of new Blair, new Obama, new Blair, is perfectly absurd. How would turning back to Blairism win back Labour voters who voted SNP in the elections, when the SNP were running a vibrantly anti-austerity left-wing campaign? How would it win back Green voters? And how would it win back UKIP voters from their positions of old Labour on economic matters?
Yes, I think by any objective assessment, the logical conclusion is Labour's got to move to the left now, because it's been outflanked on the left from the SNP and by the Greens, and on economic matters by UKIP too, which has taken a very populist economic message out to voters. And so yet we've got this wave of Blairites coming out now in the media saying, no, we've got to actually go back to this ludicrous, this mythical centre ground.
Yeah, but a centre ground is, by definition, a midpoint between left and right. Chuka is not the centre ground in British politics.
Not at all.
If you take the Greens, the SNP and UKIP, how does Blairism end up as the centre ground?
Well, it only does
vis-a-vis the Conservatives.
We've got to mention Rupert Murdoch here, because I think he's played a massive role in the election again. And not only that, not only has he played a massive impact, had an influence on the result, a massive influence, his papers are now seeking to tell us who should be the next Labour leader.
Yeah.
And I think we've got to examine this Murdoch link to this cancer in British politics, and I'd go as far to describe it as that every election since 1979, the party that the Sun has supported has won the election. Some of us thought that these days of Murdoch power were on the wane and that the new social media that would change things. But the depressing point, the old media is still very strong. And
old media continues to drive the agenda. There's
sadly
no doubt about that. What's going to be different about the Conservatives this time? I've been surprised by how brash, how belligerent even their first few days in power has been.
Well, the shackles are off now, aren't they, really? And in a sense, that's a good thing, because there's nobody else they can blame. You know, they very successfully blamed the unpopular majors of the coalition on the Lib Dems, and I hold no brief for the Lib Dems whatsoever. But that was that was the Tory tactic. They can't do that anymore. They've got a majority. They can do what they like, really. So I think that's a positive in some respects. And I think that the most important thing now for progressives in Britain is not to become too demoralised. Because if we allow ourselves to become demoralised, then I think we're beaten. There's an awful lot of very reactionary policies which are going to be coming through now, which the majority of the British public don't support. As you said, only 24% supported Cameron. And out of those, how many actually knew what the policies were? How many of those voted for Cameron because they were frightened by the so-called Scottish scaremongering about the SNP? How many actually looked at the manifesto? And I think so there's going to be a growing anger about this government in the months ahead, and that's our opportunity to build a very strong progressive opposition to this on several fronts. We have to do it on several fronts.
Speaking of Scotland, in the last government, Cameron saved the union, so-called. How's it going to look like this government?
Well, I mean, the big problem here is you've got the Scottish people have voted. The majority of them, SNP's had a landslide there, and they voted for a party that rejects everything that Cameron really stands for. They're a social democratic party. They're to the left of Labour in Scotland. And yet we've got a government in Westminster that's committed to austerity, that is a pro-war neoconservative government. We've got a lot of issues like Trident that are going to come up. If the British government tries to take us to war against Syria, the people in Scotland quite opposed to to those neocon policies. So I think that's going to be an enormous
it's a recipe for another referendum.
Another referendum,
and
yes.
Scotland on its way out.
Yes.
Which would be, therefore, a very Pyrrhic victory for David Cameron.
Yes.
Of the Conservative and Unionist Party to preside over what looks now almost inevitable, the partition of the country, the loss of half of the landmass of the state that he was elected to be Prime Minister of. Last word, are Murdoch and crew going to succeed in imposing their kind of Labour leader on the Labour Party?
Well, I think that there is one school of thought which says that progressives can't be elected or can't be allowed to be elected as a British government unless you've got the support of Rupert Murdoch. And I think that's that. And I noticed a tweet from a leading Murdoch journalist who was saying, basically, the tweet was that, served Ed Miliband right, he tried to take Murdoch on, look what happened to him. So there's a kind of warning. People will look at that. Labour challengers to the leadership candidates will look at that and may fear. And
the emaciated Labour membership may well
yes, so that is a big danger, but something's got to be done about this. I think that unless we analyse the role of Murdoch and the media in this and work out solutions to this, we aren't going to get the kind of progressive Labour Party that we all want. I'm an ex-Labour Party member, as you are, George.
Too.
Yes, we all are, and we won't go back. We want to see socialist policies that the people want, and yet we've got this man Murdoch trying to dictate what policies our party has.
Well, we'll see about that. Neil Clark, Thanks, as
Thanks, George.
always. And now it's your turn to tell us what you think through the portals of social media. What's rattling, Gayatri?
Great response on the election results. Andy Hearn says about Labour that they went into an election with a leader that didn't look like a PM and carried a message that wasn't clear.
Well, that's absolutely right. You had to be a graduate in politics to pick up the nuance of Ed Miliband's radicalism. And, well, as to what he looked like, I thought the stumble on the eve of the election on the question time said it all.
I know, I pity him. And we received this fantastic picture from Barbara, quoting Mark Twain, saying, if voting made any difference, they wouldn't let us do it.
Very good.
Well, that's all that we've got for this week.
Which, alas, means that's the end of the show.
Stay in touch with us on RT_Sputnik on Twitter, and on Facebook. You can like us on Sputnik on Russia Today. It's goodbye from me, Gayatri.
And from me, George Galloway. It's been marvellous.